They say the Mississippi River keeps secrets better than any confessor, but on that humid August night in 1847, even the mighty waters couldn't hide what happened at the Beauregard plantation outside Baton Rouge. 23 witnesses saw Mrs. Charlotte Beauregard, wife of Louisiana State Senator Theodore Beauregard, being carried from the slave quarters at 3 a.m, her white nightgown stained with something dark that wasn't mud, her eyes vacant, as if her very soul had been extracted. The local sheriff's records from that night mysteriously vanished 2 days later. The parish priest refused to speak of it until his dying breath 40 years later, and every slave who had been in those quarters that night was sold to different states within the week. What you're about to hear isn't just another Southern Gothic tale. It's the suppressed truth about one of Louisiana's most powerful families and the night that changed everything. Before we continue with the story of the Beauregard plantation, if you're fascinated by America's hidden historical mysteries, make sure to subscribe to Liturgy of Fear and hit that notification bell. And let us know in the comments what state or city you're listening from. We love connecting with fellow seekers of dark truths across the nation. The morning after that terrible night, the sun rose over Louisiana sugar fields as if nothing had changed, but everything had. Baton Rouge in 1847 was a city caught between worlds. The state capital had only recently moved there from New Orleans, bringing with it ambitious politicians, wealthy planters, and the complex social hierarchies that defined antebellum Louisiana. The air hung thick with the scent of magnolias and burning sugarcane, while paddle-wheelers churned the Mississippi, carrying cotton, sugar, and human cargo to markets near and far. Theodore Beauregard stood at the apex of this world. At 45, he owned 3,000 acres of the most fertile land in East Baton Rouge Parish, worked by 137 enslaved souls. His sugar mill produced more refined sugar than any other in the region, and his voice in the state senate could sway votes on everything from infrastructure projects to the enforcement of the increasingly harsh slave codes that governed Louisiana. But it was his wife, Charlotte, who truly captivated Baton Rouge society. 20 years his junior, she had arrived from Charleston 5 years earlier as Theodore's bride, bringing with her an education unusual for women of her time. She could speak French, Latin, and, surprisingly, several West African dialects she claimed to have learned from her childhood nurse. At social gatherings, she would entrance guests with her knowledge of history, philosophy, and medicine, subjects most deemed inappropriate for ladies of standing. The Beauregard plantation house rose 3 stories above the river road, its white columns gleaming like bones in the Louisiana sun. The main house contained 22 rooms, each more opulent than the last, filled with furniture imported from Paris and paintings commissioned from New Orleans' finest artists. But it was the layout of the plantation that would prove significant to our tale. Unlike most plantations where slave quarters were positioned at a considerable distance from the main house, Theodore had arranged his property differently. The quarters formed a horseshoe shape, with 30 small cabins housing the field workers, and at the center of this horseshoe stood a larger structure, what the enslaved people called the keeping house. This keeping house served multiple purposes. It was where the sick were tended, where women gave birth, and where the plantation's domestic workers prepared special items for the main house. But there were whispers about this building, whispers that never reached the ears of white society. The enslaved spoke of it only in hushed tones, calling it the place where spirits gather in their native tongues. Among the enslaved population was a woman named Marie Claire, though the Beauregard's ledgers listed her simply as Mary, housemaid, aged 30. She had been purchased from a plantation near New Orleans 3 years prior, and unlike many of the others, she could read and write. Dangerous skills for an enslaved person to possess. Marie Claire served as Charlotte's personal maid, accompanying her everywhere, observing everything and saying almost nothing. The summer of 1847 had been particularly brutal. The heat seemed to press down on the plantation like a physical weight, and strange illnesses had swept through both the enslaved population and the white overseers. 7 people had died in July alone, their bodies burning with fever before suddenly growing cold as winter ground. The parish doctor, Josiah Henley, had declared it a peculiar strain of yellow fever, though he privately confided to colleagues in New Orleans that he had never seen symptoms quite like these. It was during this oppressive summer that Charlotte Beauregard's behavior began to change. She started taking long walks at dusk, always in the direction of the quarters. She dismissed her husband's concerns, claiming she was distributing medicine to the sick, fulfilling her Christian duty. Theodore, preoccupied with an important legislative session about railroad expansion, paid little attention to his wife's new charitable interests. August 15th, 1847, began like any other day at the Beauregard plantation, but by nightfall it would become a date whispered in fear for generations. The evening started with a dinner party. Senator Beauregard had invited several prominent politicians and planters to discuss the upcoming legislative session. Among the guests were Judge William Treadwell, plantation owner Charles Dufresne, and Father Bernard Leclerc from St. Joseph's Cathedral. The men retired to Theodore's study after dinner, while Charlotte excused herself, claiming a headache. Marie-Claire later testified, in the only recorded statement that survived before she disappeared, that Charlotte had indeed retired to her room, but had seemed agitated, pacing back and forth while muttering words in a language Marie-Claire didn't recognize. At approximately 11 o'clock, Charlotte dismissed Marie-Claire for the night, something she had never done before. What happened next comes from multiple sources, though many details remain frustratingly inconsistent. The overseer, Jonas Hartley, reported seeing Charlotte walking toward the quarters at 11:30, dressed in her white nightgown and carrying what appeared to be a leather satchel. He claimed he called out to her, concerned for her safety, but she didn't respond, moving with what he described as an unnatural purpose, like she was being pulled by invisible strings. In the slave quarters, the night was far from quiet. Samuel, a field hand who occupied one of the cabins nearest to the keeping house, later told investigators, before he was hastily sold to a plantation in Texas, that he heard singing coming from the building. Not the hymns or work songs common among the enslaved, but something older, with rhythms that seemed to make the very air vibrate. Celia, who served as the plantation's midwife, was inside the keeping house that night, tending to a young woman named Delphine, who had fallen ill with the strange fever. According to Celia's account, given to a traveling northern journalist years later under promise of anonymity, Charlotte appeared in the doorway at midnight exactly, her leather satchel now bulging with unseen contents. She looked like Mrs. Charlotte, but she didn't move like her, Celia recalled. Her feet barely touched the ground, and her eyes, Lord help me, her eyes were rolled back, showing only white, but she moved like she could see everything. Charlotte supposedly spoke to the assembled enslaved people in perfect Yoruba, a West African language that none of them had heard her speak before. She opened her satchel and withdrew items that Celia refused to describe, saying only that they were things that shouldn't exist in a Christian world. The ritual, for that's what witnesses insisted on calling it, despite investigators' attempts to find another explanation, lasted for 3 hours. The keeping house grew so hot that condensation ran down the walls, like the building itself was sweating. The singing grew louder, incorporating call and response patterns that seemed to emerge from the very ground beneath their feet. At precisely 3 in the morning, everything stopped. The silence was so complete that Samuel said he could hear his own heartbeat from 30 feet away. Then came the scream, not from Charlotte, but from somewhere that seemed to be inside the walls themselves. The door to the keeping house burst open, and Charlotte stumbled out, her nightgown no longer white but stained with patterns that looked deliberate, almost like writing in an unknown script. She collapsed in the dirt, her body convulsing. That's when Judge Treadwell, who had been roused by the commotion, arrived with Theodore and several other men from the dinner party. What they saw defied their understanding of the world they thought they controlled. The immediate aftermath of that night was a masterclass in Southern society's ability to bury inconvenient truths beneath layers of propriety and selective amnesia. Charlotte was carried back to the main house where Dr. Henley was summoned. His medical notes, discovered decades later in his grandson's attic, paint a disturbing picture. Charlotte's temperature fluctuated wildly, one moment burning with fever, the next cold as a corpse. Strange marks had appeared on her skin, not wounds exactly, but patterns that seemed to emerge from within, forming symbols that hurt to look at directly. Most disturbing of all, she spoke continuously for 3 days, but not in English or French or any language the doctor recognized. Theodore Beauregard acted swiftly to contain the scandal. Every enslaved person who had been in the keeping house that night was sold within the week, scattered to plantations across Texas, Mississippi, Alabama, and Georgia. The keeping house itself was burned to the ground, officially blamed on a cooking fire accident. The overseer, Jonas Hartley, was dismissed with a generous severance and a stern warning never to speak of what he had seen. But secrets have a way of spreading like water through soil. Within Baton Rouge's enslaved community, whispered stories began to circulate. They spoke of Charlotte not as a victim, but as someone who had been seeking something specific in those quarters. Some claimed she had been visiting secretly for months, learning from an old woman named Mama Shara, who had been brought from Haiti years before, and was said to know things that predated Christianity itself. Mama Shara had died just 2 weeks before that fateful night, but not from the fever that had claimed so many others. She had simply announced one morning that her time had come, had lain down in her cabin, and stopped breathing at sunset. Charlotte had been present at her death, the only white person Mama Shara had permitted near her in her final hours. Father Leclerc, who had been called to provide last rites for Charlotte, though she recovered, making them unnecessary, left only one written account of that night. In a letter to the Archbishop in New Orleans, discovered in Vatican archives a century later, he wrote, "What I witnessed defies theological explanation. Mrs. Beauregard spoke of things that no Christian woman should know, the true names of angels that appear in no scripture, rituals practiced before the flood, and most disturbing of all, she described with perfect accuracy the contents of sealed church documents that have never left Rome. When I pressed her on how she knew these things, she laughed and said, 'The old gods never left, Father. They just learned to wear new faces.'" The Catholic Church's response was swift. Father Leclerc was transferred to a remote parish in northern Louisiana, where he spent his remaining years in relative isolation, refusing to discuss the events at the Beauregard plantation even on his deathbed. Meanwhile, Charlotte's recovery was nothing short of miraculous, or perhaps suspicious. Within 2 weeks, she appeared completely normal, with no memory of that night. She resumed her social duties, hosted tea parties, and attended church services as if nothing had happened. But those who knew her best noticed subtle changes. She no longer walked in the gardens at dusk. She refused to go near the area where the keeping house had stood. And sometimes, when she thought no one was watching, she would trace strange patterns in the air with her fingers, her lips moving in silent recitation. Theodore, for his part, threw himself into his political career with renewed vigor. He became one of the loudest voices supporting stricter slave codes, particularly those forbidding any gathering of enslaved people for religious or cultural purposes not supervised by whites. His colleagues assumed this was typical planter paranoia, but those who had been at the plantation that night knew better. 3 months after the incident, in November 1847, a stranger arrived in Baton Rouge. He introduced himself as Professor Augustus Brenner from Harvard College, claiming to be researching Southern agricultural practices, but his interests seemed to lie elsewhere entirely. Brenner was a peculiar man, tall and gaunt, with eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they saw. He took rooms at the St. Charles Hotel and began making inquiries about the Beauregard plantation. His questions were careful, oblique, but focused on specific details: the layout of the former slave quarters, the backgrounds of enslaved people who had been sold, and most particularly, any information about Charlotte Beauregard's life before her marriage. What Brenner discovered would have destroyed the Beauregard family's reputation had it become public knowledge. Charlotte's maiden name had been Charlotte Drayton, and she came from one of Charleston's oldest families. But the Draytons harbored a secret that went back generations. In 1693, one of their ancestors, Elizabeth Drayton, had been accused of witchcraft, but had escaped prosecution when several witnesses mysteriously recanted their testimonies. The family had maintained their social position, but whispers followed them through the centuries. More significantly, Brenner found evidence that Charlotte had spent 2 years in Paris before her marriage, ostensibly to complete her education. But the finishing school she claimed to have attended had no record of her enrollment. Instead, Brenner traced her to a boarding house in the Latin Quarter, where she had associated with a group of scholars who studied ancient texts and practiced what they called natural philosophy, a euphemism for interests that bordered on the occult. Among Charlotte's associates in Paris had been a Haitian scholar named Jean-Baptiste Dessalines, no relation to the revolutionary leader, who had fled to France after the Haitian Revolution. Dessalines was known for his extensive collection of pre-Columbian artifacts and texts describing religious practices that predated European colonization. He had disappeared in 1844, shortly before Charlotte returned to America, and his entire collection had vanished with him. Brenner's investigation led him to interview James Colton, a former overseer at a Dufresne plantation who had been present the night of the incident. Colton, deep in his cups at a tavern in Port Allen, revealed something that other witnesses had failed to mention or had been too frightened to say. There was something in that keeping house, Colton slurred, his hands shaking as he lifted his glass. Not just the people, but something else. Mrs. Charlotte, she brought it with her in that satchel, and when she opened it, God help me, I saw things moving that shouldn't have been able to move. Like pieces of the night itself had come alive. Colton was found dead 2 days later, officially from alcohol poisoning, though the expression frozen on his face suggested he had died in absolute terror. Brenner's most significant discovery came from an unexpected source. Marie Claire, Charlotte's former maid who had supposedly been sold to a plantation in Georgia, had actually never left Louisiana. She had been hidden by a network of free people of color in New Orleans, and when Brenner finally located her, she was willing to talk for a price. According to Marie Claire, Charlotte had been preparing for that night for months. She had been collecting items. Soil from specific locations around the plantation, water drawn from the Mississippi at exact times, and most disturbing of all, personal effects from each of the enslaved people who would be present in the keeping house. She knew their true names, Marie Claire explained. Not the names in the ledgers, but the names their mothers gave them, the names they never spoke aloud. She knew things about them that they had never told anyone. She said she needed to complete the circle that was broken. When Brenner asked what circle she meant, Marie Claire's expression grew haunted. The circle between the old world and the new, between the living and the other things. She said the land was sick because the connections had been severed, and only by restoring them could the fever be stopped. Indeed, the strange fever that had plagued the region had ceased completely after that night in August. Not a single new case had been reported, and those who had been ill recovered with surprising speed. It was as if whatever had caused the sickness had been satisfied or expelled. As November turned to December, the situation at the Beauregard plantation grew increasingly unstable, though the outside world remained largely unaware. Theodore began experiencing nightmares that left him screaming in his sleep. But these were not ordinary nightmares. According to his valet Marcus, who had served the family for 15 years, Theodore would speak during these episodes in voices that were not his own. Sometimes it was the voice of an old woman speaking Creole, sometimes a child reciting numbers in Latin, and once, horrifyingly, what sounded like multiple voices speaking simultaneously through his throat. Master Theodore, he'd wake up with scratches on his arms, Marcus would later tell investigators. Deep ones like from fingernails, but his own nails were trimmed short, and the scratches, they formed patterns. Letters maybe, but in no alphabet I ever seen. Charlotte would comfort him, but her method of calming him was unusual. She would whisper continuously in his ear, in a language none of them recognized, and Theodore would fall into a deep, death-like sleep that lasted exactly 12 hours. During these periods of unnatural sleep, his body temperature would drop so low that frost would form on the windows of their bedroom, even though December in Louisiana rarely saw such cold. The slaves who had been brought in to replace those who were sold began reporting strange occurrences. Tools would move on their own in the fields. The soil in certain areas would be warm to the touch even in the cool December mornings. Most unsettling, they claimed to hear singing at night coming from where the keeping house had stood, the same call and response patterns that had been heard that August night. But there were new elements to these occurrences that hadn't been present before. The enslaved workers reported seeing Charlotte in places where she couldn't possibly be. Joshua, a field hand from Virginia, swore he saw her standing in the middle of the cotton field at noon, completely still, facing the sun with her arms outstretched. When he blinked, she was gone. 20 minutes later, the house staff confirmed she had been in the parlor the entire morning, hosting a quilting circle with the other plantation wives. These doubled sightings became increasingly frequent. Charlotte would be seen simultaneously in her bedroom and walking through the quarters. She would be at dinner with Theodore while also being observed in the cemetery, kneeling at Mama Shara's grave. Each time, witnesses were certain of what they had seen, and each time there was irrefutable proof that Charlotte had been elsewhere. Professor Brenner, who had taken to spending his evenings in the archives of the St. Joseph's Cathedral, made a discovery that connected these strange events to something much larger. He found references in the church records to similar occurrences dating back to the founding of Baton Rouge. Every generation, it seemed, there was a woman who served as what the old texts called a bridge between worlds. These women always appeared during times of great spiritual imbalance, and their actions, whether voluntary or involuntary, seemed to restore some kind of equilibrium. But the cost was always the same: madness, disappearance, or death within 7 years of their first manifestation. Brenner traced the pattern back through history. In 1791, there had been Marie Thibodeau, a French Creole woman who had mysteriously known the locations of mass graves from a slave rebellion that had been completely covered up. She had led authorities to 17 burial sites before disappearing into the bayou, leaving behind only her clothes arranged in a perfect circle. In 1815, there was Elizabeth Fortier, an American settler's wife who had suddenly begun speaking in indigenous languages she had never learned, revealing the locations of sacred artifacts that had been hidden during colonization. She had died exactly 7 years later, on the same calendar date as her first episode. Her body found covered in symbols that appeared to have been burned into her skin from the inside. The pattern was clear. Every 30-35 years, a woman would emerge as a conduit for something that demanded acknowledgement, something that required a human vessel to complete unfinished spiritual business. And Charlotte Beauregard was the latest in this line. On December 10th, Charlotte's pregnancy began to show physical signs that defied medical explanation. Dr. Henley, who examined her weekly at Theodore's insistence, documented abnormalities that he would later try to destroy, though copies survived in his assistant's private papers. The swelling of her abdomen was inconsistent, sometimes appearing to be 5 months along, other times barely showing at all. More disturbing were the movements he felt during examination. They didn't feel like a child's kicks or shifts. Instead, he described them as deliberate, almost intelligent movements, as if something inside was exploring its confines, testing the boundaries of its prison. During one examination, Dr. Henley placed his stethoscope on Charlotte's belly to listen for the baby's heartbeat. What he heard sent him stumbling backward in shock. Instead of a single heartbeat, he heard what sounded like dozens, all slightly out of sync, creating a rhythm that seemed to pull at something deep in his chest. When he tried to describe it later, all he could say was that it sounded like a congregation of hearts, all beating with different memories. Charlotte herself seemed unaware of these anomalies. She went about her daily routines with an eerie normalcy that unsettled everyone around her. She would host tea parties where she would suddenly stop mid-sentence, stare at nothing for exactly 13 seconds, then continue as if nothing had happened. She would embroider baby clothes with patterns that hurt to look at directly, geometric designs that seemed to shift when observed peripherally. Theodore, meanwhile, was deteriorating rapidly. He had lost nearly 30 pounds since August, his once robust frame becoming gaunt and hollow. He refused to eat meat, claiming it tasted of grave soil. He couldn't bear to be in rooms with mirrors, insisting they showed things standing behind him that weren't there. Most tellingly, he had begun writing letters to people who didn't exist. Or rather, people who had existed but had died years or decades before. These letters, discovered hidden in his study, were responses to conversations that seemed to be ongoing. He wrote to his grandfather, who had died in 1820, discussing the terms of the agreement. He corresponded with a business partner who had drowned in 1843, negotiating the price of safe passage. Most disturbing of all, he wrote daily letters to someone he referred to only as the keeper, begging for more time to prepare the vessel. On December 15th, a stranger arrived at the plantation. She introduced herself as Madame Celeste Arsenault, claiming to be a distant relative of Charlotte's from New Orleans. She was an elderly woman, perhaps 70 years old, with eyes that seemed far older. She wore all black, including a veil that obscured most of her face, and she spoke in a whisper that somehow carried clearly across any distance. The house staff was immediately suspicious. There was no record of any Arsenault in Charlotte's family, and Charlotte herself showed no recognition when introduced to the woman. Yet Theodore insisted she stay, giving her the best guest room and ordering the staff to fulfill her every request. Madame Arsenault's requests were unusual, to say the least. She asked for soil from 7 different locations on the plantation, water collected during the new moon, and most disturbing of all, a vial of blood from every person living on the property, enslaved and free alike. When the overseer protested, Theodore flew into a rage unlike anything anyone had seen from him before, threatening to have the man horsewhipped if he didn't comply. The blood collection took 3 days. Madame Arsenault supervised personally, using different needles for each person, each one inscribed with symbols that seemed to writhe in the lamplight. She spoke to each person as she drew their blood, whispering words in a language that predated French, English, or any African tongue. Several people later reported that when she looked into their eyes, they saw not their own reflection, but glimpses of their ancestors, faces they recognized from family resemblances but had never seen before. On December 18th, Professor Brenner attempted to visit the plantation to warn them of what he had discovered. He never made it past the front gate. The moment his carriage crossed onto Beauregard property, the horses reared in terror and refused to go further. When Brenner attempted to proceed on foot, he was overcome with such a powerful sense of dread that he vomited and collapsed. He was found hours later by passing travelers, delirious and speaking of the child in the shadows, growing fat on borrowed time. That night, every flame on the plantation burned with a greenish tint. Candles, oil lamps, even the cooking fires turned the same sickly color. The light they cast created shadows that moved independently of their sources, shadows that seemed to gather in corners and doorways, watching. Marie-Claire, who had been secretly returning to the plantation at night to gather information for her own reasons, witnessed something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. She saw Charlotte and Madame Arsenault in the family cemetery, standing at the grave of Charlotte's infant sister, who had died 30 years before Charlotte was even born. They were digging with their bare hands, pulling something from the earth that Marie-Claire couldn't quite see clearly. Something wrapped in what looked like placental membrane, despite having been buried for decades. Whatever they retrieved, they carried it back to the house with the reverence reserved for holy relics. Marie-Claire followed at a distance and saw them take it to Charlotte's bedroom, where Theodore waited in a state that could only be described as religious ecstasy, tears streaming down his face as he repeated, "The circle turns, the debt is paid, the child comes home." On December 20th, Charlotte announced she was pregnant. Not that she had been pregnant for months, but that she had just become pregnant. Dr. Henley, called to examine her, found this medically impossible given the physical evidence of advanced pregnancy he had been documenting for weeks. Yet Charlotte insisted, with a certainty that brooked no argument, that conception had occurred that very morning at dawn. The seed was planted when the sun touched the earth, she told him, her eyes focused on something beyond the physical world. 9 days it will grow, 9 nights it will gather, and on the 9th hour of the 10th day, it will crown. This meant December 29th, a date that Brenner's research had identified as significant in multiple occult traditions. A day when the veil between worlds was considered thinnest in the dying days of the year. The household staff began abandoning their positions with increasing frequency. They gave various excuses, sick relatives, better opportunities elsewhere, but the truth was written in their terrified expressions. Those who remained did so either out of loyalty spanning generations or because they literally had nowhere else to go. Among those who stayed was old Benedict, the stablemaster who had served the Beauregards for 40 years. On December 22nd, he made a decision that would prove crucial. He secretly sent word to Father Jean-Baptiste Duchesne, an elderly priest in New Orleans known for his knowledge of what the church euphemistically called irregular spiritual situations. Father Duchesne had been involved in the church's response to the 1815 incident with Elizabeth Fortier. He was one of the few people alive who understood the pattern that was playing out at the Beauregard plantation. When he received Benedict's message, he immediately began preparing for a journey to Baton Rouge, gathering items that hadn't been used by the church in Louisiana since the early days of colonization. Items that existed in the gray area between Christian ritual and something far older. Meanwhile, Madame Arsenault had begun what she called the preparation of the vessel. This involved Charlotte spending hours each day in a specially prepared room where all the mirrors had been covered with black cloth, the windows sealed with wax mixed with cemetery dirt, and the floor marked with intricate patterns drawn in a mixture of salt, ash, and what appeared to be ground bone. Charlotte would sit in the center of these patterns while Madame Arsenault walked around her in precise geometric paths, speaking continuously in that ancient whisper. Witnesses who passed by the room reported hearing not just Madame Arsenault's voice, but what sounded like dozens of voices speaking in harmony, creating a sound that resembled wind through an ossuary. Theodore, for his part, had ceased sleeping entirely. He spent his nights writing furiously in a journal, filling page after page with text that switched between English, French, Latin, and symbols that resembled no known alphabet. When Charlotte's maid glimpsed one of these pages, she saw what appeared to be architectural plans, not for a building, but for something that existed in more dimensions than 3, with annotations describing load-bearing sorrows and foundational griefs. On December 23rd, animals began dying. It started with the chickens. Every rooster on the plantation died at exactly dawn, their bodies found arranged in a perfect circle around the chicken coop. Then the pigs, all 17 of them, collapsed simultaneously at noon, their bodies contorted into positions that suggested they had been trying to bow or kneel. By evening, every horse in the stables was dead, their eyes wide open, their mouths twisted into what looked horrifyingly like human smiles. Only the cattle survived, but they stood in the fields lowing continuously, a sound that witnesses described as almost musical, like a hymn being sung by creatures that had forgotten they were animals. That night, Charlotte disappeared. She had retired to her room after dinner, claiming fatigue from her pregnancy. When Theodore went to check on her an hour later, he found the room empty, the window open, and strange symbols drawn on the walls in what appeared to be ash mixed with blood. The symbols hurt to look at directly, seeming to shift and writhe when observed. But this time, there was something else. In the center of the room, where Charlotte's bed should have been, was a hole. Not broken through the floor, but existing where the floor should be. A perfect circle of absolute darkness that seemed to pull at the light around it. Theodore stood at its edge, staring down into depths that shouldn't have existed, depths that seemed to go far deeper than the foundation of the house, deeper perhaps than the earth itself. From somewhere in that darkness, he heard Charlotte's voice, but multiplied, harmonized with itself across different ages. He heard her as a child, as a young woman, as an old crone she had never lived to become. All versions of her voice spoke the same words. The payment comes due, the circle completes. The child rises from the foundation of sorrow. Theodore's scream brought everyone in the house running. They found him on his knees at the edge of the impossible hole, reaching into the darkness while babbling about bringing her back from the other side of time. Madame Arsenault appeared in the doorway, no longer the elderly woman she had presented herself as. Her true appearance was something that witnesses could never quite agree upon. Some saw her as impossibly ancient, others as heartbreakingly young, and still others claimed she appeared to be multiple women occupying the same space simultaneously. "It is time," she said in a voice that seemed to come from the walls themselves. "The vessel has descended to gather what was scattered. She will return with the payment required." A search party was immediately organized, though half the men refused to join once they learned Charlotte had last been seen near the ruins of the keeping house. Those who did go, Theodore, Dr. Henley, Judge Treadwell, and 4 overseers, armed themselves not just with guns, but with crosses, holy water, and iron horseshoes, though none could have said exactly what they expected to face. They found Charlotte's trail easily enough. Her bare feet had left prints in the dirt, but the prints were wrong. They showed not just her current footsteps, but overlapping impressions of different sizes: child's feet, adolescent, adult, and impossibly the shuffling gait of an elderly woman. It was as if every age Charlotte had been and would never be was walking the same path simultaneously. The trail led directly to the ruins of the keeping house. There, in the center of the burned foundation, Charlotte had cleared a perfect circle in the ash and debris. She sat in the middle of this circle, her white nightgown, the same one she had worn in August, spread around her like a shroud. But she was not alone. The shadows around her had taken form, but not the vague shapes witnesses had reported before. These were specific shadows, distinct figures that the men recognized with growing horror. They saw the shadows of the enslaved people who had been sold away, standing in the exact positions they had occupied that night in August. They saw the shadows of those who had died from the fever, their forms wavering like heat mirages. And they saw other shadows, older, stranger shapes that seemed to predate human presence on this land. Charlotte was speaking to these shadows, and they were responding, not in words, but in movements that created patterns in the air, patterns that hurt to follow with the eye. She would gesture, and the shadows would flow like water into new configurations. She would speak a name, and that shadow would solidify momentarily, becoming almost flesh before dissolving back into darkness. Theodore called out to his wife, but she showed no sign of hearing him. Her eyes were completely white, rolled back in her head, yet she moved with perfect precision, her hands pulling things from the leather satchel beside her, the same satchel from August, though it now seemed to contain far more than its size should allow. From it she withdrew the vials of blood Madame Arsenault had collected, pouring each one onto the ground in specific locations within the circle. As each vial emptied, the shadow of the person whose blood it contained grew more solid, more present. She withdrew the soil samples, scattering them in patterns that corresponded to constellation maps that wouldn't be discovered by astronomers for another 50 years. Then she withdrew something that made even the bravest men step back. A bundle wrapped in burial cloth that moved with a life of its own. As she unwrapped it, they saw it was the thing she and Madame Arsenault had retrieved from the infant's grave. But it was no longer dead tissue. It pulsed with vitality, growing as they watched, taking on features that were almost but not quite human. Dr. Henley, fighting every instinct telling him to flee, stepped forward with the intention of pulling Charlotte from the circle. The moment his foot crossed the ash line, he screamed and fell backward. Later, he would claim that in that instant, he had seen and felt everything, the entire history of the land beneath their feet, stretching back millennia before European arrival, layer upon layer of death and birth, ritual and sacrifice, all of it crying out for acknowledgement, for restoration. But more than that, he had seen the true nature of what Charlotte was doing. This wasn't a summoning or a possession, it was a birth. She was giving birth not to a child, but to an accumulation of all the children who had never been born, all the lineages cut short by violence and slavery, all the potential futures that had been severed. The thing growing in her womb, and simultaneously in the bundle before her, was the concentrated possibility of all those lost lives. Charlotte's voice rose to a crescendo, speaking in languages that predated human speech, words that seemed to bypass the ears and resonate directly in the bones of those listening. The shadows began to spin around her, faster and faster, creating a vortex of darkness that pulled at everything nearby. Leaves, debris, even small stones were drawn into the whirling mass. Theodore, in desperation, pulled out the pistol he carried and aimed it at his wife. But before he could fire, Charlotte's eyes suddenly focused, looking directly at him with an expression of infinite sadness and terrible understanding. "It's already done, Theodore," she said in her normal voice, though it seemed to come from everywhere at once. "The payment has been made. The circle is complete. The land will have what it's owed." At that moment, Charlotte's body convulsed violently. She screamed, not in pain, but in what sounded horrifically like ecstasy. The bundle in front of her began to move more violently, growing rapidly, taking on the shape of a child, then an adolescent, then cycling back to infant, as if it couldn't decide what age it should be. From her swollen belly came a sound that should not have been possible, the cry of a newborn infant, though she was supposedly only days into this new pregnancy. But this cry was multiplied, harmonized, as if dozens of children were crying out at once. The shadows suddenly condensed, rushing toward both Charlotte and the bundle like iron filings to a magnet. They seemed to enter her through every pore, while simultaneously flowing into the thing she had unwrapped. The very air seemed to scream as reality stretched to accommodate something that shouldn't exist. Judge Treadwell, who had been standing frozen in horror, suddenly pulled out a flask of holy water Father Leclerc had given him months ago. He threw it toward the circle, and where it landed, the ground itself seemed to recoil. Steam rose from the earth, and in that steam they all saw visions. Fragments of the ritual that had been started generations ago, pieces of a working so vast and complex that no single human mind could comprehend it all. They saw indigenous shamans beginning something on this land centuries ago, a protection, or perhaps a prison for something older still. They saw the arrival of Europeans breaking that working, leaving it incomplete. They saw enslaved Africans recognizing the danger and trying to patch it with their own traditions. They saw generation after generation of women serving as conduits, each one adding a piece to a puzzle they didn't fully understand. And they saw what would happen if the ritual completed successfully. Not a catastrophe, but a transformation. The land itself would remember everything that had been done upon it, and that memory would take physical form. Charlotte collapsed, the bundle in front of her now fully formed into what appeared to be a child of about 3 years old, though its features shifted constantly, showing faces of different ethnicities, different eras, as if it were every child who had never been born on this land. The night fell silent except for the continued crying of an infant, though Charlotte's belly had returned to its normal size, showing no signs of pregnancy at all. The child thing that had formed from the bundle stood up on uncertain legs, its eyes, ancient, terrible, knowing, surveying the men who stood frozen at the edge of the circle. When it spoke, its voice was the combination of every language that had ever been spoken on this land, from the first human inhabitants to the present moment. I am the debt made flesh. I am the sorrow given form. I am what you owe and can never repay. I am here to remember, and in remembering to balance the scales. Theodore fell to his knees, sobbing. The child thing walked to him, placed a hand that was simultaneously infant-soft and ancient-weathered on his shoulder, and whispered something in his ear that made him scream as if his soul was being flayed. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The child thing dissolved like morning mist, the shadows returned to their natural forms, and Charlotte lay unconscious but breathing in the center of the circle. The only evidence of what had transpired was the fact that every man present had aged visibly. Their hair showed new gray, their faces new lines, as if years had passed in those few minutes. Charlotte was carried back to the house, where she remained unconscious for 3 days. During that time, transformations occurred throughout the plantation that defied explanation. Every mirror in the plantation house cracked spontaneously, but the cracks formed patterns. Maps of the Underground Railroad that wouldn't be discovered by historians for another century. Every book in Theodore's library rearranged itself, organizing not by alphabet or subject, but by some system that seemed to reflect the emotional weight of their contents. Most disturbing of all, every enslaved person on the plantation reported having the same dream. A child walking through the quarters, touching each cabin door, leaving bloody handprints that were visible in the dream but vanished upon waking. But with these handprints came something else. Knowledge. Each person touched in the dream woke knowing things they shouldn't know. They knew the true names of ancestors sold away generations ago. They knew the locations of family members scattered across the South. They knew which overseers could be trusted and which planned violence. Most importantly, they knew that something fundamental had changed in the balance of power on the plantation, though they couldn't say exactly what. On the 3rd day, Charlotte woke as if from a normal sleep, with no memory of the past 6 months. She didn't remember the August incident, the pregnancy, or the Christmas Eve ritual. Dr. Henley examined her and found no physical evidence she had ever been pregnant, though he kept to himself the fact that her internal anatomy showed signs of having carried and delivered a child. Not recently, but repeatedly, as if she had given birth dozens of times. Madame Arsenault had vanished without a trace. Her room showed no signs of ever having been occupied. And when Theodore tried to describe her to others, he found he couldn't remember what she looked like. All he could recall was the sensation of being in the presence of something vast and ancient, temporarily wearing human form. Father Duchesne arrived from New Orleans on December 30th, a day too late to prevent what had occurred, but perhaps in time to understand it. What he found at the Beauregard plantation convinced him that something unprecedented had happened. Not a possession or a haunting, but what he would later describe in sealed Vatican archives as a balancing of the spiritual ledger. "The land itself has memory," he wrote in his report. "When great injustices are committed, that memory seeks expression. It will find vessels through which to speak, willing or unwilling. What occurred at the Beauregard plantation was not evil, precisely, but rather a forced acknowledgement of debts that can never truly be paid." The immediate aftermath was dramatic. Within a week, Theodore freed every enslaved person on his plantation, providing them with money and land, actions that made him a pariah among other planters, but which he insisted were necessary, though he could never explain why. He would only say that he had seen the true cost written in shadow and blood, and could no longer bear to profit from it. Charlotte lived for another 5 years in a state of seemingly perfect mental health, except for one peculiarity. She could no longer bear to be alone in the dark. She required candles or lamps burning throughout the night, and if they ever went out, she would wake screaming about the child in the shadows, trying to return to her. But there were other changes. Subtler but perhaps more significant. Charlotte found that she knew things she had no way of knowing. She could speak languages she had never learned, not just African languages, but indigenous tongues that had been extinct for generations. She knew the location of every body buried in unmarked graves for miles around. She knew the true names of people who had been renamed by slave traders, names that had been thought lost forever. She began using this knowledge quietly but effectively. She would send anonymous letters to families, telling them where to find lost relatives. She would leave packages at crossroads containing documents that proved ownership of land stolen from indigenous peoples. She would whisper certain words to enslaved people who passed her in town, words that gave them power over their masters in ways that couldn't be explained but were undeniably effective. Theodore, meanwhile, descended into a kind of functional madness. He continued his duties as a senator but began proposing legislation that seemed to come from nowhere. Bills that would have provided reparations to enslaved peoples, that would have returned land to indigenous tribes, that would have fundamentally restructured the power dynamics of the antebellum South. His colleagues dismissed him as having lost his mind, but his proposals, recorded in the congressional record, would prove eerily prescient of changes that would come a century later. In his private journals, discovered only after his death, Theodore wrote obsessively about the child. Not a physical child, but something that existed between states, neither fully real nor entirely metaphorical. He claimed it visited him nightly, showing him visions of what the South could have been if different choices had been made, futures that were now impossible, but whose ghosts lingered in the realm of potential. The child grows stronger, he wrote in one entry, not in body, for it has no fixed form, but in influence. It whispers to the sleeping. It shows the guilty their crimes in dreams. It plants seeds of change in minds that think themselves closed. The child is revolution given form, justice made flesh, the future reaching back to reshape the past. Professor Brenner, who had recovered from his collapse at the plantation gates, spent the remaining years of his life trying to understand what had occurred. His research led him to a startling conclusion. The ritual at the Beauregard plantation hadn't been an isolated incident, but part of something much larger. He traced similar incidents at 17 other plantations across the South, all occurring between 1845 and 1850. In each case, the patterns were the same. A white woman of unusual education, connections to enslaved people with knowledge of African spiritual practices, astronomical alignments, and rituals that seemed to be healing some fundamental wound in the land itself. But more than that, he found evidence that these incidents were connected, forming a network of spiritual working that spanned the entire South. Each ritual had been a node in a vast web of power, and when the final node was activated at the Beauregard plantation on Christmas Eve 1847, something fundamental had shifted in the spiritual landscape of America. The land remembers, Brenner wrote in his final paper, which was rejected by every academic journal and only survived in his personal effects. The land remembers every drop of blood spilled upon it, every life cut short, every potential future destroyed. And sometimes, when the weight of that memory becomes too great, the land finds a way to speak. What we witnessed at the Beauregard plantation was not supernatural, but rather natural in the deepest sense. The inevitable consequence of trying to build a civilization on a foundation of human suffering. The Beauregard plantation never recovered economically. Within 6 months of the incident, the sugar crops failed completely. The cane would grow normally until harvest time, then rot overnight, turning black and emitting a smell that made workers vomit. Theodore attempted to salvage his fortune by selling the land, but no buyer would take it after spending a single night on the property. Those who tried reported the same experience. Dreams so vivid they seemed more real than waking life. Dreams in which they lived through the experiences of every person who had suffered on that land. They would wake knowing things about the slave trade, about the destruction of indigenous communities, about the true cost of sugar and cotton that no amount of forgetting could erase. In 1852, Charlotte gave birth to a son, a normal pregnancy, a normal birth, a normal child. But those who knew the family well noticed something unusual about the boy. He had eyes that seemed too old for his face, and he would sometimes speak to people who weren't there, holding long conversations with what he called the shadow children. As he grew, it became clear that he had inherited something from that night in December. He could see the history of objects by touching them, knowing instantly who had made them, who had owned them, what joys and sorrows they had witnessed. He could speak any language after hearing it once. Most remarkably, he seemed to know the future, not in detail, but in broad strokes, as if he could see the patterns that history would follow. This child, named Gabriel by his parents, would grow up to become one of the most effective but least known figures in the abolitionist movement. Working always from the shadows, he would provide crucial intelligence to the Underground Railroad, expose the locations of hidden slave markets, and mysteriously appear wherever the need was greatest. Those who worked with him said he seemed to be guided by invisible hands, as if the accumulated will of all those who had died in bondage was working through him. Charlotte died on August 15, 1859, exactly 12 years after the first incident. She died peacefully in her sleep, but those who prepared her body for burial found something that was never reported to the authorities. Her skin bore markings that appeared to have grown from within, not scars or tattoos, but patterns in the pigmentation itself, as if her body had become a living document. These patterns, when examined closely, formed words in dozens of languages, telling the stories of people whose names had been erased from history. The nun who prepared Charlotte's body spent 3 days carefully copying these patterns before they faded with Charlotte's last breath. That document, hidden in the archives of a New Orleans convent, contains the only record of thousands of lives that would otherwise have been completely forgotten. Theodore lived until 1862, spending his final years in a state that his doctors called dementia, but which might have been something else entirely. He claimed to live in multiple times simultaneously, experiencing the past, present, and future as a single moment. His last coherent words, spoken to his son Gabriel, were, "The child in the shadows was right. Every debt is paid, though not always by those who incurred it. The land remembers everything. Make sure you remember too." The Beauregard plantation was abandoned after Theodore's death. The main house burned in 1863 under mysterious circumstances. Witnesses claimed the fire burned cold, producing no heat despite consuming the entire structure. Where the house had stood, nothing would grow for 100 years except a single type of flower that botanists couldn't identify. Blood-red blossoms that appeared only on August 15th and December 24th each year. The land where the keeping house had stood became known locally as the Remembering Ground. Former enslaved people would sometimes travel hundreds of miles to stand in that spot, claiming that doing so allowed them to connect with lost family members, to remember names and faces that slavery had tried to erase. Well into the 20th century, people reported hearing singing from that spot on certain nights, not ghostly or ethereal, but powerful, defiant, the sound of voices refusing to be forgotten. Professor Brenner's final notes, discovered after his death in 1871, contained one last revelation. He had found evidence that the rituals performed at the Beauregard and other plantations had not been endings but beginnings. The children born from those rituals, not physical beings but something between metaphor and reality, were still active, still growing, still working to balance scales that might never be truly balanced. They move through history like threads through fabric, he wrote, invisible but essential, holding together a narrative that continually threatens to unravel. They are in the dreams of the guilty and the memories of the innocent. They are in every struggle for justice, every moment of reckoning, every time someone says, "No more" to oppression. The ritual at the Beauregard plantation didn't summon something new into the world. It gave form to something that had always been there, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. The truth of what happened at the Beauregard plantation lies buried beneath layers of shame, fear, and deliberate forgetfulness. The official records were destroyed, the witnesses scattered or silenced, and the physical evidence burned or buried. But truth, like the land itself, has a way of preserving memory. In 1923, when the Beauregard property was being surveyed for development, workers found something that stopped the project permanently. In the ground where the main house had stood, at a depth that suggested it had been there since the original construction, they found a metal box. Inside was a document written in Charlotte's hand, dated August 14th, 1847, the day before the first incident. The document was her confession, written in advance of what she knew was coming. In it, she revealed that everything that had happened had been planned, not by her alone, but by a network of women across the South who had recognized that the spiritual wound created by slavery would eventually destroy everything if not addressed. They had spent years learning, preparing, gathering the knowledge and power necessary to perform a working that would force acknowledgement of what had been done. "We do not do this out of hatred," Charlotte wrote, "but out of necessity. The land cries out with the blood of the innocent. The future cannot be built on a foundation of unacknowledged horror. What we release tonight will not be pleasant or comfortable, but it will be true. And only through truth, however terrible, can healing begin." She went on to describe the network, wives and daughters of plantation owners who had been secretly educated by enslaved women who had learned the spiritual traditions that their husbands and fathers were trying to eradicate. They had recognized that they were uniquely positioned to serve as bridges between worlds, to use their privilege to create openings for justice. "History will not remember us kindly, if it remembers us at all," Charlotte wrote. "We will be dismissed as hysterical women, victims of possession or madness. But we know what we are. Midwives to a terrible birth, servants of a justice that transcends our understanding. The children we bring forth are not ours, but belong to all those whose children were stolen, sold, or never allowed to be born. Through our bodies, the denied future forces itself into the present." The letter concluded with a warning. "This is not the end, but the beginning. The children born of shadow and sorrow will grow stronger with each passing year. They will whisper in the ears of the powerful, show the guilty their crimes in dreams, and slowly, inexorably, bend the arc of history toward justice. The land remembers, the children remember, and eventually, willingly or not, everyone will be made to remember." Today, the site of the Beauregard plantation is an empty field owned by the state but never developed. Locals still avoid it after dark, though few remember exactly why. Sometimes people report seeing lights moving through the field in patterns that suggest a large gathering, though no one is ever found when investigated. On certain nights, when the humidity is high and the Mississippi runs slow, you can allegedly hear singing, work songs and hymns, African chants and indigenous prayers, all harmonizing into something that sounds like the voice of the land itself. The descendants of those who were enslaved at the Beauregard plantation have their own stories, passed down through generations. They speak of dreams in which their ancestors visit them, not as ghosts, but as memories made manifest, carrying messages and warnings. They speak of knowing things they shouldn't know, of children born with gifts that can't be explained, of a debt that was paid in shadow and blood that somehow set something free. What really happened at the Beauregard plantation in 1847? Was it mass hysteria, elaborate fraud, or something that transcends our understanding of reality? The evidence, what little remains, suggests all three and none of them. What is certain is that something fundamental changed that night, something that rippled out through history in ways that are still being felt. The land remembers everything, every injustice, every cruelty, every life cut short, every future denied. And sometimes, when the weight of that memory becomes unbearable, it finds a way to make itself known. The women who served as vessels for that revelation paid a terrible price. But perhaps they understood that some prices are worth paying, that some truths must be told regardless of the cost. The child born of shadows still walks among us, they say. Not as a physical being, but as a presence in the collective unconscious, a reminder that debts unpaid do not simply disappear. It is in every struggle for justice, every moment of reckoning, every time someone stands up and says no more. It is the future that was denied forcing itself into the present, demanding acknowledgement, demanding change. The Beauregard scandal was covered up, the records destroyed, the witnesses silenced. But truth, like seeds buried in dark soil, has a way of finding the light. And in that light, we see not just the horror of what was, but the possibility of what might still be. A world where the land's memory is honored, where the children of shadow are acknowledged, and where the circle, finally, can be complete. What do you think of this story? Do you believe Charlotte was a victim of forces beyond her control, or a willing participant in something that should have remained buried? Was she a hero who sacrificed everything to force a reckoning with injustice, or a woman who meddled with powers that should never have been invoked? Leave your comments below and share your thoughts on what really happened at the Beauregard plantation. If this tale sent chills down your spine and made you question the hidden histories buried beneath our feet, subscribe to Liturgy of Fear for more suppressed truths from America's darkest corners. Hit that notification bell to ensure you never miss our investigations into the stories they didn't want you to know. And remember, not all mysteries are meant to be solved. Some secrets are buried for a reason, but sometimes those secrets refuse to stay buried, and when they rise, they bring with them a reckoning that can reshape the world. Until next time, keep your lights burning bright, and listen carefully to the stories the land itself